Welcome to The Conservative Edge. I'm Dr. Joe Corey, your host. This show will give you an edge on the truth. It is about substance on each and every issue. I know that the world is preoccupied right now with COVID-19 and all of that, and demonstrations and whatever. But we are looking ahead at a very important subject, which is peace in the Middle East. As many of you may know, President Trump has proposed a Middle East plan and a peace plan, and that was really engineered by his son-in-law, Mr. Kushner. We have a great guest to address this issue with us. He's a professor of political science and political sociology at the Lebanese University. He has a doctorate from the Sorbonne, which is a top school in France. And he has written extensively on almost every political topic that I could think of. His name is Dr. Charles Chertouni, and we are very glad to have you, Charles, here. Welcome to The Conservative Edge.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you.
I counted about 30 attempts at peace in the Middle East, some between Israel and the Arab League, some between the Israel and the Palestinians, some with and some without third parties and whatever. Many of them ended up nowhere, but all of them indicated, at least to me, that there is a serious interest in the world in solving that very vexing problem. 3 huge success stories, and I'll let you comment on each one of them. The first one, of course, is the Camp David Agreement of 1978. Frankly, I cannot think of any achievement by President Carter at the time that really is more important than this one. Could you give us your view of the 78 agreement?
Well, I think this was the major breakthrough, into a stalemated conflict. For the first time, the stalemated conflict, which started in 1948, which means after the bipartition of, Palestine into an Israeli and a Palestinian territory. This was the major breakthrough. And this is what makes it, singular in the history of this conflict.
All right. Well, clearly what happened is that Egypt got back the Sinai Desert. Egypt became the first country to recognize the state of Israel, which is huge. And little concessions were made by the Israelis on the West Bank front. The second one was the Oslo Accord of 1993. Here, another Democrat, Bill Clinton, was critical in achieving that. And that was also extremely significant because
it was important because for the first time, there was a breakthrough on what I call the Palestinian and Israeli front. In which sense? In the sense that for the first time, the Palestinians have acknowledged the right of the state of Israel to exist as a legitimate state in this part of the world. And at the same time, the Israelis have acknowledged the right of the Palestinians to have a homeland based on a 2-state solution, which recapitulates, the previous the previous settlement that has been drafted by the United Nations in 1947, which stipulated the creation of a twin state, one in Palestine and one in Israel, and based on the what I call the post 1960s, the previous to 1967, conflict.
The most important thing is that they recognize the Palestinian Authority as the sole representative of the Palestinian people, and in return, Arafat recognized the state of Israel as being a legitimate state and a state where the rights of all of its people include the right to live in peace. And that is, I think, very, very critical. Do you agree?
Yes, of course. It's a major peace treaty. And as a matter of fact, the way I qualified it as being a breakthrough, conveys this idea, which means it's for the first time that the two populations have acknowledged each other's rights. But what was to be completed, what was to be achieved is the stage whereby the Palestinians are going to set up their Palestinian Authority and start building up, state institutions, whereas the Israelis have received on the Palestinian part the acknowledgement of their legitimacy from the Palestinian themselves, represented as a matter of fact by the PLO.
Correct. Now, the third one, of course, is the 25 October 1994 agreement between Jordan and the Israelis. And that was extremely significant, in my opinion. It was a great sight to see Ezer Weizman, the president of Israel, shaking the hand of King Hussein. I thought it was a logical step for this to take place after the Oslo Accord. Do you agree?
I mean, this was not only for the Oslo Accord, it's the recapitulation of the previous accord, starting from Camp David until, the normalization taking place between Israel and Jordan, which means, the Israelis were eager at that point of time to complete the process of reconciliation and acknowledgement, be it on the Palestinian side or on the Arab side. Okay, so this was a very important step in the sense that this conflict, this lasting conflict, started what I call a normalization dynamic, which has been challenged, okay, beforehand, and which has been challenged, in the aftermath of these accords.
Agreed. The question here, before we start discussing the elements in the Trump proposal for peace in the Middle East, we should really look at the possibility of its success. And the only way I could see us trying to solve this puzzle is by asking ourselves the question, what are the demands, the absolute demands of the Palestinians? What are the absolute demands by the Israelis? And is the proposal capable of bridging those two sets of demands? So if you don't mind, I would like to start with the Palestinian demands.
Well, let's start, with the methodology. I think the methodology is very important. We have witnessed for the first time, an American proposal or an American solution that has not been conducted by state institutions. They were conducted by the presidency through a mediation that was not, the one we are used to. The one that we are used to is the one that has been conducted by the different, secretaries of state, starting with the Camp David and ending up with the Oslo Accords. So for the first time, we have witnessed what I call, a personal diplomacy initiated by the president through his son-in-law. So this is the first. So therefore, the Palestinians were not very much happy about the process, the way it has been adopted, since they have seen in this methodology, an original bias towards the Israelis at their very expense. Having said this, I would move on to their demands. Their demands are very simple. They want to be sitting around the same table in order to decide over the agenda. However, we have to acknowledge the fact that when they were given this opportunity, they ended up botching this opportunity. And therefore, this is what made someone like President Trump, adopt kind of unilateral style of diplomacy and propose something after having agreed with the Israelis on the stipulations of this proposal without a previous consultation or without a beforehand consultation, with the Palestinian. This is what has driven the kind of alienation on their part, and this is what has driven what I call a distancing on their part from the methodology that has been proposed by the president.
Understood. When we talk about Palestinian, Dr. Shartouni, we are talking about actually two power bases within the Palestinian movement. You have the Palestinian Authority and you have Hamas. And one of the problems here is that Hamas does not even recognize the state of Israel. So that's a major concern for dialogue. In 2014, they had reached some kind of an agreement with the Palestinian Authority, but they have never relinquished the position that Israel is actually an occupying force. But that's as a footnote. Some of the demands will be, for example, the right of return. The Palestinians are insisting that Palestinians who have been kicked out of Palestine at the time of around 1948 should be able to return home. That's one of their concerns. The status of Jerusalem, I'm sure you agree, this is one of the biggest elements. And compounding the problem is that Israel in 1980 passed a law saying that Jerusalem is part of Israel, period. And then the United Nations disagreed with them in 2012. They're saying that Jerusalem is really part of the West Bank. And then finally, President Trump recognizing Israel as the capital, Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, and he moved the United States Embassy to Jerusalem. Your point is very well taken, but all of these factors compound the difficulties in reaching a final agreement. Do you agree?
Let me put it this way. I think, we're not here supposed to start from scratch. We have to build up on a legacy of mediations. We have to build on a legacy of United Nations resolution. We have to build on a legacy of attempts at addressing this issue from different perspectives. And therefore, one of the major attempts at solving this problem is based on what? On a dual state, on a two-state solution. In this respect, the proposal of President Trump joins back, the idea of a two-state solution, whereas, within Israel, you have, even at the official level, people who are challenging the idea of a two-state solution. There is something positive about the proposal, which is the two-state solution. And the two-state solution is the proposal that has been advocated by every mediation and by every resolution. So we shouldn't go back onto a stage whereby we are going to discuss the principle of two or one state solution. We have to build up on this. And, in this respect, the Trump proposal goes back to this kind of proposal. But what is problematic is the problem of the Israeli colonies. The proposal advocates the freezing of these colonies for the next 4 years. Unfortunately, what we have witnessed lately is that Prime Minister Netanyahu has recounted on this agreement, and he started, advocating the immediate colonization of the colonies of the West Bank and the how would I call it, the formalization of the occupation of the Valley of Jordan, etc., etc. So therefore, we are in a vicious circle whereby we are talking, unilaterally on these issues, and the Palestinians and the Israelis are not sitting around the same table to tackle, these issues one by one in order to reach a consensus on these issues. We shouldn't be starting, and we shouldn't be questioning, and we shouldn't be, going back onto a stage where none of these, staples of negotiations existed. They have always existed. We have to go back onto these principles and build upon them and try to iron out the differences in this regard.
Agreed. But the question here is, we have some positions by the Palestinians and by the Israelis that have been so solidified, so to speak, as to allow very little room for flexibility. The Palestinians say, we want all Israeli settlements, you call them colonies, I call them settlement, to disappear. The Israelis said, we're not going to do that. That's one big problem. We will negotiate, but we're not going to do that. The second one is Israelis want full control of anything that's related to security. And the Palestinians want to have their own security system. They cooperate with the Israelis right now. And they also want to have control over the land use, water, and electricity. And all of these were provided by Israel for the most part. And then the third problem, which is I think is you just dealt with, is do you want to deal with one state, with a so-called binational state, or do you want to talk about a two-state solution? The Trump plan clearly takes us all the way to the two-state solution, and it seems that this is the only thing acceptable to the Israelis right now. The one-state solution is not acceptable as far as Israel is concerned, so everybody is falling on that point that you are making. However, the Israeli position said something different. You know, the status of Jerusalem to the for the Palestinians is extremely important. But so it is for the Israelis. The Israeli says, hey, Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, period. They're not going to negotiate on that. If they're going to negotiate under the plan, if they're going to negotiate about anything regarding Jerusalem, is maybe a portion of each Jerusalem that becomes capital of the new Palestinian state. Do you agree?
Well, the problem is the following. It's not up to me or up to you or up to anybody else to talk about these issues, but unto the Israelis and the Palestinians to sit together and talk. And so far, we have not achieved what I call, a round table. That's why, the problem of this proposal, it has fallen down so far because it has failed to create a dynamic of consultation in the first place, and therefore a dynamic of negotiation in the second place. Therefore, what needs to be done at this period of time is how to jumpstart, this consultation, how to jumpstart, even the unofficial one, in order to pave the way for a due negotiation process, at a later stage. Having said this, I think now, since we are in a pre-electoral period of time in the United States, and since we are, having some internal problems within the United States, I don't think that the Palestinians are ready to engage any of these dynamics or any of these courses that might be considered at this point of time, for one simple reason: they are waiting for the outcomes of the forthcoming elections.
Agreed.
Therefore, what I would suggest at this period of time is that there must be an unofficial diplomacy, that is that works on ironing out the differences and bringing the two parts onto a negotiating table in order to discuss about all these pending issues. And therefore, I will have to summarize my views on these issues. The idea of a shared sovereignty insofar as Jerusalem is concerned has always been proposed, has always been on the table. It's a question of demarcation lines between what is the shared sovereignty in Jerusalem, and where do we put, the shared sovereignty demarcation lines in Jerusalem, etc., etc. That's up to the negotiators to decide and to reach a consensus. Otherwise, whenever it comes to the demilitarization of the new national entity or of the forthcoming national entity, it's also an issue that needs to be discussed and that needs to be referred to what I call the security issues raised on both sides. And from what I see myself is the possibility of an international policing, run by the United Nations and agreed upon by the Israelis.
I don't think the Israelis.
Whenever it comes to the.
I don't think the Israelis, Dr. Shartouni, will be interested in the United Nations.
Yes, I know. They're not interested in this.
They are so focused on security matters. Even they will fight wars, as you know, they did in 2006 with Hezbollah, and then later over the
That's
issue
very
of.
much I
Okay.
understand fully.
I just want to make sure that we
fully
understand.
this point of
Yeah,
view.
the only reason I'm mentioning these issues, Dr. Shartouni, is because I am not convinced that the plan proposed by President Trump is holistic enough and it deals with every single one of those very complex issues. Settlements, the Hamas issue. Do you think Hamas could actually undo any deal?
Well, I don't think so. Hamas, it's worse than this. Hamas is part of a sabotaging politics. It is part of a sabotaging politics advocated by Iran on the one hand and advocated by Muslim Sunni radicals on the other hand. So we have to forget about Hamas. Hamas will have to be cowed into acceptance. And for Hamas to be cowed into acceptance, you have to make sure that the Palestinian Authority sustains its course, survives in order to be able to convince the rest of the Palestinian population on the relevance of this proposal and whatever may follow this proposal, on the one hand. On the other hand, there is something interesting that was offered by the peace plan of President Trump, which is the $50 billion that are going to be earmarked for the construction of the Palestinian economy and the Palestinian social development projects, etc., etc., etc. So therefore, this is something that is very important. This is something that is very much enticing, and this is something that is going to be carried out by a larger pool of supporters emanating from regional powers and from local power brokers in the Middle East.
You're quite concerned about the atmospherics and who's going to be sitting at the table and so on and so forth. Let's talk a little bit about that if you don't mind. It's going to be definitely the Israelis, the Palestinian Authority. Hamas will not be represented except through the PA if they need any representation. And the Americans, of course. Do you see any other party participating?
No, I mean, the normal parties are the Palestinian Authority, and that is supposed to represent, the Palestinian people as a whole, and Israel, obviously, and the American mediators, and eventually, a representation maybe from the United Nations. But still, I think the three brokers would be enough at this stage.
Well, there was a different approach used by Prime Minister Olmert, if you remember. He met 36 times with Mr. Abbas, and they were making progress. They kept on meeting. It didn't come to what we expected it to come to. In other words, full recognition and elimination of Hamas and so on, and more negotiations on the contiguous nature of the two parts of Palestine. But could that be a substitute? Could, for example, could Netanyahu make a big trip to the PA area or vice versa?
The location should be decided as being part of the, let's say, choreography. I mean, and this choreography should be approved by both, actors. I mean, this might be, I don't know, maybe in the United States, maybe in somewhere in Europe, or might be somewhere, between Israel and the Palestinian Authority, West Bank. So this is up to them to decide, because this is part of the symbolic, elements that count mostly for both, actors.
What do you think will happen if Netanyahu and Abbas lock themselves in a room until the peace breaks out? Is there any chance of these two people coming together in the mutual interest of both of their people and to say it's time for peace? Do you think that has any chance of happening?
Well, let's say, let's put it frankly. I mean, any diplomacy needs to be prepared. Any diplomacy needs, what we call preliminary talks, preliminary, reunions, preliminary teams working on the different issues, etc., etc. the meeting of the two men, or the meeting of the two top leaders who represent respective the state of Israel and the Palestinian Authority, are here to formalize what has been, dealt with at length by the different experts who have been commissioned by, the two parties in order to address these issues. This is, from a diplomatic perspective, because it's not, it's not a personal issue.
I understand that, Professor. My point here is this. We have tried every formula since the last agreement of 1994. Every formula has been tried. All I'm trying to tell you here is there a way for us to imagine, I could imagine it, the two leaders of the two countries just putting their heads together with all the preparations in place. Everything is on the table right now. We all understand what we want, and let's try to reach an agreement. Because the presence of the United States, is presumed, the presence of the United States is presumed to be a very constructive factor. There is little trust these days, and the reason for that is the move of the embassy to Jerusalem, recognition of the Golan Heights as part of Israel, and now there are rumors that the Israelis may be very interested in the Jordan Valley, as well as a certain part of the West Bank that is close to the Jordanian border. Now, if any of these things happen, all of these things are complicating factors. And I believe if the United States endorses the move toward Israel taking part of the West Bank, the atmospherics will not be as encouraging as otherwise would be the case. Your final thoughts.
You have a regional environment that is not very much helpful. We are in a region that is marred by major conflicts, and conflicts going into every direction. And therefore, there is nothing that is here to help both parties, address issues in a peaceful, or in what I call, a distressed environment. No, we are in a very stressed regional environment, and therefore this is not going to be a helpful environment, and therefore we cannot count on regional actors, facilitating, the negotiation process. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, this situation of insecurity and this situation of major political uncertainty prevailing over the whole Middle East is going to promote the career of extremists on both sides, and it is going to make actors very much adamant about emphasizing what is conflictive rather than what helps them, get together, be more accommodating, or be more likely to promote what I call understanding, consensus, empathy, etc., etc. So this is what makes, the situation very much complicated, and this is what promotes, the career of those who are ready to sabotage, the peace process, be it from within or from without, or on the intersection between the two.
Well said. Thank you, Dr. Shartouni. It's been a pleasure to have you on the show. You have always, through our previous discussions on many of the issues that affect the Middle East, especially that affect Lebanon, you've always been a voice of reason. Thank you, Dr. Shartouni. It's been a pleasure to have you on the show. This is The Conservative Edge. Please tune in to future shows. Thank you.